Today is MLK Sunday, and typically it is something that is celebrated in many Baptist traditions because that is the tradition in which MLK hails from himself. He was part of the Progressive National Baptist Convention. But today I want to bring it to our church, even as disciples of Christ, because I just find this so radically powerful to explore. It's very interesting, just the legacy of MLK. He's one of those figures that is celebrated by a little bit of everyone, but his quotes are often co-opted by people who use it for an agenda that MLK would not have remotely been about. In fact, MLK was himself very, very progressive, so much so that a modern blogger, Virgil Walker says that King rejected the doctrines of the virgin birth, the second coming of Christ, and the existence of a literal hell, and reflecting upon just what MLK was about, what he actually believed and preached. And what Virgil Walker goes on to say is that what is clear is that Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Christian. Something that is very often concluded about many of us as progressive Christians. And so Martin Luther King Jr., he was very much a progressive Christian. He was someone who rejected these doctrines of eternal hell, this idea of an existence of a literal hell. He rejected a lot of these notions that we as progressive Christians have deconstructed ourselves. And he himself preached a lot of the things that we preach, this idea of truth and justice. And he was a part of the Progressive National Baptist Convention. He was very much a progressive Christian. And so today, as a progressive Christian community, we want to reflect upon the life and the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. And as we do that, I want to say what I always say is that at Mission Gathering, sermons are designed to start discussions, not end them. And so don't feel like you have to agree with everything that I say today. Don't feel like you have to be completely on board. That is kind of the distinction between many progressive communities and more fundamentalist communities, to not feel like you have to agree with everything the pastor says, but to have this be an ongoing dialogue as we engage with our tradition and the text. And so as we engage with all this, particularly this subject of race, I just want to kind of just set the framework just for kind of my own background. My full name is Braeden Storkerson. If you're good with kind of telling what different names and the origins are from, I am biracial. And so I am Mexican as well as Norwegian. You may not be able to tell that by looking at me. The Norwegian traits are quite prominent here, but I am biracial, Norwegian and Mexican. And so on my dad's side and the Norwegian side, I kind of grew up with both of these cultures at play in my household. My grandparents on my father's side were very, very proud Norwegians. They raised us, like a lot of the Nordic, the Santa traditions kind of come from Nordic mythologies, kind of the Yule Ball there. And so there was this emphasis on that. There was this teaching of just how to make lefse, just all the different traditions there. But then also there was very much a way in which I was raised Mexican. And when I say I was raised Mexican, I mean that I was very much raised in that culture. And so I had many, many family members. I still go to extended family reunions, and I do not know everybody there because there are like 50-something great aunts and uncles, and they always introduce themselves to me, and it goes in one ear, out the other sort of thing. And so this is just kind of an ongoing reality. So I have several cousins and that. And so the interesting thing is as I grew up, I kind of realized this distinction between the experiences of me and my brothers and what my cousins experienced growing up, being people of color. That as I got into high school, as I started driving, the distinctions in terms of when I got pulled over, my experiences, versus my brown cousins when they got pulled over and what they experienced. And the same can be said of many, many different realities, that I was placed in honors English classes while some of my cousins were placed in English as second language classes when English was their native language. There was this assumption, there was this radical prejudice that takes place. And so there was this huge reality of just the privilege that I experienced growing up. And when I talk about white privilege, I want to kind of be clear. I'm not saying that white people don't experience problems. I've talked about many of the things that I've faced in life up here. I've talked about the disabilities that I've faced that have left me bedridden at times. I have talked to you about just how my marriage with my wife, Kelsey, the fact of the matter that is that I was married once before, and just the radical divorce and just depression and struggle that was there in that previous marriage. And so I've talked to you guys about many of my problems that I have faced in life. So when I talk about white privilege, that does not mean, I'm not saying that white people don't experience problems or obstacles in life, but I'm saying that systemic racism is not one of the obstacles that they have to overcome. That has never been something that I have had to navigate in life, of the systems of racism that exist in our world. I have not had to overcome that. My experiences versus my cousins who are people of color, their experiences have been radically different, even though we are of the same family. And so growing up, when I went to school, I grew up in Temecula, California, which if you've ever been to Temecula, it's pretty white. And so growing up in Temecula, we were kind of presented this very specific narrative that I've found is quite common in the United States. When we were taught about racism, when we were taught about Martin Luther King Jr., we were essentially taught in school that, hey, racism, that was a terrible thing that used to exist. But, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, they came along, and they put an end to all of that, They like Rosa Parks sat on the bus, Martin Luther King marched, and now we're past all of that. But if you really look at the history, it's much more complicated than that. The fact of the matter is that MLK Day was signed by Ronald Reagan's administration, and when he signed it, there was kind of this interesting statement that he made at the press conference about that. Ronald Reagan said, hey, I would have liked an unofficial holiday such as Lincoln's birthday, but since they seem so bent on making it a national holiday, I find it a good symbol. And there's two things I want to point out there. First off, the they language, as well as symbol. That MLK Day and its inclusion in kind of the curriculum of the United States, it served kind of as a mere symbol of racial progress when there was really still radical progress to be made. Even the president who signed the bill himself in the declaration of this announcement was still using this us and them language. There still very much was this racism that was present in the legal systems of the United States. And yet there was this progress that was made. There was this hope, there was this excitement that, hey, segregation is being put an end to. But many people had this imagined idea that when the law changed, then things would change as a whole. But naturally, as things progressed, people found that that was not the case. And so legal scholars, they kind of began talking, and particularly people like Derek Bell, the first law professor at Harvard, who was an African American, he really began kind of leading this conversation of, okay, well, what is still wrong? That segregation and slavery have ended, but there is still deep racism present, obviously, in the United States in the experiences of Black Americans. And so Dr. Derek Bell, he made this statement that he says, it appears that my worst fears have been realized. We have made progress in everything, yet nothing has changed. And if you hear that, and if it sounds like critical race theory, it's because it is. Dr. Derek Bell, he's known as kind of the father of critical race theory. Like I said, he's the first Black professor at Harvard Law School, and he really kind of led the way in this conversation. And as many of us know, critical race theory is something that is very much in the cultural conversation right now. And so I bring this up because I don't think we can have an honest conversation about race without addressing this elephant in the room, which is that critical race theory, this conversation has been in school board meetings around the country, and it's frankly difficult to have a conversation about race without shouting that you're talking about critical race theory. And so I just want to kind of acknowledge that, and particularly just acknowledge that there is a narrative that has been spun here about critical race theory. It really goes back to this guy, Christopher Rufo. He is a conservative activist who has really been prominent in this, and he really led this campaign to demonize critical race theory. In fact, this isn't me just theorizing. He tweeted this in 2021, and he says that we have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all the various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex the entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. And so Christopher Rufo, he's been very successful in this, as we all know, because most people, they do hear critical race theory, and there is this visceral reaction that a lot of people have to this. But the reality is, critical race theory, it has been grossly misunderstood. But it is a highly respected school of thought that was taught in law schools. I want to emphasize that. It's a school of thought taught in law schools. This is a graduate level idea. And so the idea that critical race theory is being taught in elementary schools is pretty absurd. As one of my friends put it, it's outlawing critical race theory in the elementary school classroom is like outlawing calculus in first grade. It's just not. It's not something that is being taught there anyway. And so I just want to kind of talk about, okay, what is critical race theory? And then ultimately bring it back to this larger conversation of what the Bible says about race and justice. And to talk about what critical race theory is, to kind of clear this up, I'm going to turn to the work of Richard Delgado as well as Gene Stefanik. And they wrote the critical race theory introduction. It's kind of the most scholarly work on this. And critical race theory, there's kind of 6 core tenets of it. And so essentially it starts with that racism is ordinary, not aberrational, recognizing the fact that every single human being is prone toward prejudice, of recognizing this human tendency to judge people based on their looks, to judge people too quickly, and to rush to these conclusions. And then ultimately how that then builds into, if all of us as individuals are prone toward this, how that then builds into the systems and the structures that we create in our society. And then secondly, there's this idea of interest convergence, kind of the second tenet. And this interest convergence idea simply means that those in power are typically going to give benefits to those who are marginalized when it benefits the interests of those in power. And Derek Bell has talked extensively about this and talked about how we were in the midst of the Cold War when this was kind of brewing as segregation and all of this was ended. And essentially, it was a way of making it look like we were better than we actually were to the larger global population as all of this ended. And so it was in the interest of those in power to ensure that things changed for the marginalized. This is the idea of interest convergence. This is the social construction thesis, the idea that race is a social construct. And when I say that race is a social construct, when critical race theorists say that race is a social construct, they are not saying that race does not exist. What they are saying is they are not saying that, hey, we should just ignore that we have different physical features. What they are saying is that how we then judge and create assumptions and create stereotypes about different races, that is a social construct, how we have assigned particular characteristics to particular races. And on that same note, there's the differential racialization. And what that means is that if you really just look at the course of history, how we have defined races at different points in history has evolved. That what groups of people have been demonized at different points has changed over time, and it is ultimately to benefit those in power. And so if you really just go back, I mean, there's these radically different groups that have been demonized and racialized at different points in history. And then there's also the fifth one, the intersectionality, this idea that no one person has a singular identity. Even just as I shared, I am biracial. I'm Norwegian as well as Mexican, but I'm also an American. I'm also on the autism spectrum. I'm a male. There are multiple things that I identify as that are intersecting identities. And when you talk about prejudice, there is a reality that there is an intersectionality of how people treat others. That if someone is a person of color, they get mistreated for different prejudices. If someone is a woman, they get mistreated. If someone is trans, they get mistreated. And so then if you are at the intersections of these different marginalized identities, sometimes the prejudices that are faced are much worse. And then lastly, on what critical race theory is the voice of color thesis, to really encourage to listen to people of color, to listen to the unique experiences, because only people of color can radically summarize what it is that they have experienced to then bring clarity and bring transformation. And so these are the 6 tenets of critical race theory. So when people talk about critical race theory, frankly, most people don't seem to actually know what it is, but this is what critical race theory is. It's this theorizing, it's frankly just thinking critically about race, but these are the 6 tenets right here. And so as I bring this up, I want to just say that I think it's quite reasonable to say that MLK would align with the 6 tenets of critical race theory. And I also think it's fair to say that there are biblical narratives that align with critical race theory, these 6 tenets that I have just covered, that there are biblical arguments to be made for all of those. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of the sermon is I just want to go through those 6 tenets again, but I want to show how Martin Luther King would have aligned with some of these things, as well as biblical narratives would align with some of these things. This idea that racism is ordinary, this idea that racism is something that all humans are prone toward. Martin Luther King Jr. said this: white Americans must recognize that justice for black people cannot be achieved without radical changes in the structure of our society. Because at the core of this idea of racism being ordinary, of something that all humans are prone to, is that it then leaks into the systems that we create. And this was something that MLK preached regularly, that he talked about regularly, that the social structures of the world needed to be changed in order for there to be justice. And he also went on to say, it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, because this was a common narrative by white preachers that, hey, we don't need to change the laws. Like, God just needs to change our hearts. Which, yes, God needs to change our hearts. But so he went on to say, it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me. And I think that's pretty important. And so this idea that racism is ordinary, he saw that the social structures needed to change. And then on the biblical level, this idea of how all humans are prone toward judging the outside appearance of others, the scriptures actually explicitly say this. In 1 Samuel 16:7, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. That humans are prone toward looking at outward appearance and judging based on that. This is one of the tenets of critical race theory, and it is right there in the scriptures. Interest convergence, the idea that the powerful will only award the marginalized when it aligns with their interests. This is something that, once again, MLK talked about extensively, and he actually brings up a biblical story to talk about it. He talks about how the first question in the story of the Good Samaritan, when someone is on the side of the road hurt, that those in religious power, when they walk by, the first question which the priest and the Levite asked was, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? MLK really preached this idea of interest convergence, and I think it is right there in the scriptures for us. And then the third tenet of social construction, of how we socially construct and make assumptions about people. He takes this idea that this is a very famous quote: I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. MLK radically believed in this idea that we have assigned assumptions to particular races, to particular people of color, and he believed that we could move beyond that. He preached that we could, in fact, move beyond that. But the thing is, in Genesis 1:27, there is this preaching that God created humanity in their image. In the image of God, they created them. And so from the very beginning, there's this idea that all people are created in God's image. Yet we, along the way, have assigned certain people as believing different layers about them. We have assigned certain people as being lesser or greater than others, that we have been the ones to do that. And the scriptures radically preach time and time again that no, every single human being is made in God's image. And we need to resist this idea. This differential racialization, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, as the tensions and bewilderment of economic problems become more severe, history scapegoats the Jews will be joined by new scapegoats. And so this idea that different people will be demonized in different points in history, this was something that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about. That, hey, at one point it was the Jews, at his point, it was African Americans. There will always be different people that will be scapegoated by those in power. And this is something that we see throughout the scriptures as well, that at different points throughout the Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew people are demonized, that they are oppressed. And then there's this criticism from the prophets that then once they become established as a nation, that they at different points become the oppressors. And there is this ebb and flow of how different empires step up and oppress different peoples. There is this differential racialization that happens throughout the Hebrew scriptures and throughout our history. And on that note of intersectionality, of this intersecting identities, MLK talked about this interlocking injustices, and we talk about this a lot here at Mission Gathering. He says we must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism, they're all tied together. And so for MLK, all injustices are tied together. It's not about caring about this group or that group, but that there is this connection. He says you can't get rid of one without getting rid of the other. There is this connection between injustices. And on that same thread, once again, this idea of the Samaritans. In John chapter 4, verse 9, there's this interaction with Jesus and the Samaritan woman. And as he's talking to her, she says to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." And so there was this racism that was present, but there was also the sense in which Jesus' world, as well as ours, is a patriarchal world. And so oftentimes there was this explicit sexism that was present, that men would sometimes not speak to women. There was this Jewish prayer that was quite common, that thank God I am not a dog or a woman. And so, yes, so for Jesus to be speaking, so there's this intersection of there is this sexism as well as there is this prejudice, there's this racism towards Samaritans, and Jesus here is interacting with a Samaritan woman who would have experienced both. And so she asks, "How are you asking me for a drink, a woman of Samaria?" There is this intersectionality that is present throughout the scriptures. And then lastly, the voice of color thesis, this idea that we need to listen to people who are marginalized. We need to listen to people who are oppressed because they are the ones who can speak to the experiences that need to be radically transformed and changed in the world. And there's this famous quote from MLK. It's been going around the past couple years as there have been different riots. And MLK talked about the idea that a riot is the language of the unheard. And as he says this, he asks, and what is it America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. That people of color recognize that there is deep injustice, and oftentimes people of privilege do not recognize this. They do not see this. And there's this spot in the scriptures in Deuteronomy where Moses is preaching, and Moses says, "The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression." God sees the cries of the oppressed. God hears the cries of the oppressed. And so this is why, all of this is why I say that I think it's quite reasonable to say that MLK would align with the tenets of critical race theory, and that there are biblical narratives that align with this idea of critical race theory. And lastly, on just the note of Jesus, before we transition to communion, there is this preaching from Jesus when he summarizes what his ministry is about. he reads the scroll of Isaiah, and he says that he has sent me to liberate the oppressed and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The year of the Lord's favor was this day every 49 or 50 years where all debts would be canceled, where justice would be done, where things would radically change. There would be this upheaval of the way of society structures, and equality and equity would be brought. And Jesus says that I have come to do that. I have come to liberate the oppressed. I have come to bring the year of the Lord's favor. And so to follow Jesus, to believe the gospel, is to believe that we can change things. It is to believe that we are called to liberate the oppressed. And I've talked about oftentimes, I interpret the Bible as a liberation theologian. I read the entire text in terms of how does this bring liberation? How does this bring freedom to those who are marginalized and mistreated? And this is something that we come back to time and time again here at Mission Gathering. And so before we transition to communion, the ultimate question when we engage with something like this is, well, what next? Because addressing something as large as racism in our society can feel very daunting in terms of what do we do next? And I just want to say that addressing deep systemic racism, it's not just going to be a one-day thing. It requires a long-term commitment to the work of anti-racism. And so as disciples of Christ, this denomination that we are part of, kind of the identity statement is that we are a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. And so as part of the one body of Christ, we welcome all to the Lord's table as God has welcomed us. And so when we talk about what's next, I want to actually point you to a particular ministry of the disciples of Christ, because this is the beauty of being part of a tradition, not just Christianity at large, but the disciples of Christ, that as Christians, the questions we've been asking, people have been asking and writing about and talking about for thousands of years. And then as disciples of Christ, we can say the same, that people have been engaging with these questions. And the disciples of Christ, there's this ministry called the reconciliation ministry. And so as I was prepping for this sermon, I talked to the executive director of the reconciliation ministry, Reverend April Johnson, and she really pointed us to one particular resource that I think would be very helpful for us all to start. And this is something you can start tomorrow. Well, actually, today you can go to reconciliationministry.org, and on that website, right at the very front, you will see this flyer here. Starting tomorrow, there are going to be weekly meditations upon Martin Luther King Jr.'s teachings. And each of those meditations will have a call to action. And so this will be a 6-week practice that starting tomorrow, it's kind of an odd time because we're looking at different time zones here. For us, it'll be 3:30 p.m., 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard. And so at 3:30 p.m. tomorrow, there will be a Zoom call, there will be meditations upon the words of MLK, and we will engage in how can we live this out? And so as a church, how can we begin to engage in this work, not just as a one-time thing or as a time here and there, but to engage and commit long-term to the work of anti-racism and participate in reconciliation, to commit to the work of the reconciliation ministry.